Okay, dear friends, we'll start now. Unfortunately, the injury was a bit more serious, and so Fiona's gone to have medical care. So we've lost one panellist, but I'm sure that will not change the erudite and eloquent discussions we're going to have this afternoon. But I did want to say it's wonderful when everyone cares for each other, and it was decided that she needed to have a rest. So my name is Helen Durham. I'm from RedR, and I'm really delighted to be the facilitator of this panel. It's a hard after lunch last day. Everyone's a bit tired, but the topic I think is very worthy of our attention and engagement. But before we get going, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the land of the Ngunnawal and Nunabri, I've been practicing that, Nunabri peoples, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and their continual and extraordinary connection to the land, to the waterways, to the sea, to the sky, and to note, of course, that sovereignty over this land was never ceded. So we are here to talk about the multilateral system, and even in and of this conference in the last couple of days, we've heard a diversity of views. We've heard views, if you attended the vibrant lecture by Eric, that in fact we're in a new era and we're starting from ground zero, and the withdrawal, for example, of senior or large states such as the US is a complete disruption to the system. We've heard others, such as diplomats and others engaged in this sector, to say, well, yes, we've got some bumps along the road, but you know the system's intact and it's frayed around the edges. We need to think in new ways, but we don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And then, of course, there's those that say, well, it's pretty much the same. Certainly in just a few reflections, we are seeing a lot of tensions at the moment. We're seeing pressures on the system, and we're seeing big states not only either withdraw or behave in a way that goes against rule of order, but also a number of states withdrawing from key treaties. We've seen a disrespect or a lack of adherence to rulings from institutions such as the International Court of Justice, withdrawal and disrespect for institutions such as the International Criminal Court. So a lot of the things that we've built over the last few decades, I would say, are not under, it's not just that they're under pressure, there's questioning around this whole infrastructure. And a lot of calls and a lot of action around reform. So we really want to spend the next hour and a half delving into this. We really want to hear from you. There's much wisdom and depth in the audience, just looking around. So let's get started. We've got two fabulous panellists. Leanne, to my left, is the Chief Executive at the Australian Human Rights Commission. She's an international lawyer, so very close to my heart. I see you in these troubled times. And she's worked domestically, regionally, and also with DFAT as a diplomat. So you've seen the whole landscape from different perspectives. She's had various and important roles with the UN, most recently in New York as the Chief of Policy and Best Practices for UN Peacekeeping. And I'm sure there was a lot that you learnt in that role. And she's also got an academic side with being an adjunct professor at the Western University School of Law and a couple of others. So I don't think you are, I think you're not busy enough. I think you should do a few more things. That would be my advice. And then we move across to Esperanza, who is lovely to see, and an old and dear friend and colleague. Now, Esperanza is a medical doctor, which was why she was very handy on the panel when we first started. And she's also a public health expert with over 20 years of experience in global health and humanitarian action. She is a professor and also the head of health here, Health and Human Security. A centre, or is it just called Health and Human Security? Is there a centre in that? Not yet. Oh, sorry, preemptive. Maybe after this there will be. The outcome of this seminar is that we create... No, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. It is Friday. It's Friday. She is the head of Health and Human Security at ANU. And she previously held a number of senior leadership positions and roles at the ICRC. She led the global health programs and crisis response, where we worked very closely together, so I know your incredible capacities and stamina. And she's also a global health advisor to organisations and plays many other roles too. Once again, I think a woman who has too much time on her hands plays an incredible role also with Lancet. So we've got a depth of experience here, and my plan is to ask them a couple of questions and then throw it to you as the audience to either comment or have questions yourself, and then finish up in a solution space. I do often feel that we like the problem analysis. We love a problem analysis. We love to sit in the space of articulating what is wrong, what's going wrong, where we're going. But we also really need to spend equal amount of time as what do we do with that. So let me do my first question to you, Esperanza. And I think this ties in very nicely with some of the views that whilst the big powers might be absent, withdrawing, choosing their own way to go, we're looking at middle and smaller level powers that are really rising up and making choices and making declarations and really moving forward. So Esperanza, what is it, in the first instance, what is the value of health, so to speak, to development and security? And then secondly, what are some issues around the protection of health workers and health infrastructure?
Thank you very much, Helen, for that opening, and really it's a pleasure to see you all here standing still after 2 really intense days, so 2.5 for you. So I will start with health as a broader concept. The health and well-being of populations is traditionally seen as a health sector concern. It's something that really sits within the realm of ministries of health or centers for disease control, health agencies, and doesn't necessarily involve other sectors. And I think COVID-19 really showed us that health threats and the health of populations really is a whole of government concern and a whole of society concern and transcends borders. So it cannot be contained by a single sector and cannot be managed by a single country if there is a widespread threat. So I think COVID really showed us how critical health issues are for national security, for example. If we look at military preparedness and training of militaries and national security capabilities, they were impaired for many different countries and for certain periods of time during the pandemic. Trade, heavily impacted by the issue and our over-reliance on single sources of supply chains. I don't need to remind you of how difficult it was to have personal protection equipment, even paracetamol, at some moment from India. So this is also a shock to the economy, and we have seen the fallout and the impact on economies following the pandemic. But we also see how misinformation and disinformation shatter the trust of populations in their governments, in their systems, and fuel polarization, which is still with us today. So I think that's one element that I think is very important for the conversation today, is to say the health and well-being of populations is not a single sector concern. It's really a whole of government and whole of society concern. And when we discuss, for example, later on, multilateral system reform and so on, I think that's a very good point to depart. In addition to that, I think we need to mention climate change and the fact that the impact of massive weather events, and now we are seeing the aftermath of major climate shocks in the region. They not only impact the survival of humans and the environment, but also economies. Then this food security is a risk, then economic development of nations is a risk of increased infectious diseases. So all of this is an additional shock that we can ignore, and particularly in the region is quite significant. And so somehow in this world of polycrisis, of multiple crises that collide and amplify one another, we find that we need to elevate the position of health within the political agenda in governments and the multilateral system, while at the same time governments are dealing with increased domestic pressures and with dwindling or shrinking budgets. So that's I think is a crossroad that we will need to navigate. And coming back and a segue into the attacks on healthcare, but it's also the issue in the humanitarian sector. And I think here in Australia we see it in a rather privileged position because we sometimes feel away from the humanitarian crisis that are really, really affecting more than 300 million of people today. So if we look at people in need of humanitarian assistance today, the total number is more than 300 million. To put that into perspective, that's 4% of the world's population, or 1 in 26 people. So it's a huge amount of people that are needing protection and assistance from a humanitarian perspective. And within that, health services and mental health services is one of the big parts of that package. So later when we talk about the multilateral system and the reform on financing, is how do we preserve that space to really look after people. And the final point in relation to attacks and the protection of healthcare is, unfortunately, we have not seen the number of armed conflicts we are seeing today since Second World War. And according to the International Committee of the Red Cross, we have 130 active armed conflicts today. And the number of attacks on hospitals and healthcare workers is steadily increasing. Last year, only reported or confirmed attacks, there were more than nearly 1,000 healthcare workers killed. And that number sits only as a reference to say that attacks on hospitals, ambulances, healthcare facilities have become a tactic of war, because they clearly destroy the trust of populations in a system that functions and that can deliver, and also displace populations. So that's another shock. So I will stop there and then happy to continue on the conversation.
I think that's an incredibly important point, and I think there's no doubt that healthcare workers themselves and humanitarian workers are like the canary in the mine shaft. If we're seeing a rise of attacks against these individuals, it means behind them the attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure is extremely high. And we also know that, I think statistics have been done that, the taking out of, or the killing or the maiming of a health worker has impact on thousands of people. And then you have the brain drain where people don't stay, health professionals don't stay in those countries. So I think the issue can't be, as you say, isolated to this many. It's about how it sits within the ecosystem. And in a way I was hinting to that when we say that at the moment there is a lot to say doom and gloom about and a lot to really take pause and have a sober analysis of. But I think, for example, the Australian relatively recent declaration on the protection of humanitarian workers, whilst it obviously encompasses health workers, which is a large percentage of humanitarian workers, was once again a state deciding to put on the table of international discussions an issue, very sort of a specific issue, but under that issue is a whole lot of discussion about the need to hold on to the rules-based order. And we're seeing more and more, as I said, middle-sized states and sometimes small. If you listen to what was expressed and articulated at the recent UN General Assembly, there is also voices, like there's loud voices against the system and there's voices that are bubbling away that are trying to hold it together or find new angles and ways. I'm going to move across to Leanne, but I had a whole range of questions for Fiona. I'm not Fiona, but I just thought I might flag a couple of the things that she might have flagged if she was able to be here. The questions I was going to ask her was in relation to that sort of relationship between humanitarian and development, the nexus as we call it. I always do it in talking marks because there's something about that term. Anyway, that's a whole other seminar, isn't it? Challenges with the word nexus. Don't think it's very exciting. But what that was doing and where that was sitting in the whole UN reform. And there's no doubt that there's a lot of different voices on this matter. Some are saying the UN is not reforming, UN 80. It's basically moving the deck chairs around. There's a little bit of maybe some organisations joining together, but there's not the depth of deep reflection that we need to look at the poly crisis we're facing. And others, particularly if you talk to people in the UN system themselves, I don't know if there's anyone in the room from the UN, but later jump in, challenge us, are saying, no, this is difficult, this is tough, we've got less budget, we've got more needs, so we're trying to rebuild the ship as we're moving it forward. So how can you expect us to completely reinvent something when we've got to keep going? And I think there is often a schism between an academic analysis, even the title, I didn't choose the title. Reimagining. I love the idea of reimagining, but for those of us who are at the front line having to do stuff, while we're reimagining, we've got to deal with what we've got. And so we've somehow got to find this balance between the desire for a big reform, which I think no one would question is needed, a desire to keep going because the needs are high, and desire to ensure this reimagining takes us in the right direction. So that was a mini Fiona. I'm sure she would be much more articulate, but I just wanted to add that into the panel as we unfortunately lost her for a short time while she's lying down. Oh my God, it's Friday afternoon while she's lying down with a little bit of ice. She'll be fine. Oof. I'm glad I was asked to step in this panel last minute. We've got a doctor here, so I think we're okay. So let's get back on track. Leanne, Could you talk to us a little bit about the importance of human rights, both in the context of the sort of peace and security discourse, but also in the humanitarian and development context? And with the impact of the pressure on the multilateral system, what impact is that having on human rights?
Thank you, and thanks for having me on this panel. I agree with you. I look around and there's so many people in this audience who have great things to say about this, and I'd love to hear it, so I look forward to that. Can I just start by not doing another acknowledgement of country, but by sharing with you, as Australia's NHRI, we work in the domestic space and the international space, and I know most of you are in the international space. But I suppose from where I sit, it's really important that when we're thinking about the work we do in other countries, we don't forget the work we've got to do in this country. And particularly when we're out there in the world promoting things like human rights, we should always be really conscious that we have enormous problems in this country, the treatment of our First Peoples, that really can only undermine what we say out in the rest of the world. I also wanted to acknowledge that when you talk about human rights, there's a real risk of talking about human rights from the position of an ivory tower and talking about international human rights law and how things should be. But I just wanted to acknowledge that there may be people with us today who have experienced human rights violations, and this can be very personal. So I say everything I say with that in mind. I have a slide, if we could share it. I only have one slide. But I just wanted to have that up there while I was talking. This statement is one of the most fundamental and important statements that every single country in the world signed up to at the end of World War II. Sometimes human rights work is not only about pushing forward, but holding on to how far we've come. And we need to, in my view, hold on to this with every breath we have. You'd all be aware that human rights is not only underpinned by the Universal Declaration, but also by the UN Charter. And there are 3 pillars to the UN Charter: peace and security, human rights, and economic development. So that's why human rights sits at the core of everything we all do, whatever it is we're doing. I thought to take a moment, for those who aren't as familiar, maybe to talk a little bit about what human rights are and to put them in the context of the work we all do in the international space. So when we talk about human rights as articulated in the Universal Declaration or in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights or the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, there are a big range of rights and they all have a few things in common. They're all universal rights, and by that I mean they are enjoyed by everybody, no matter where they're born, what language they speak, what religion they have. And while that might sound really aspirational, we need to hold on to that and believe in it when we're working in the work we do. Human rights are also inalienable, which means that they can't be given up or taken away. And they're indivisible as well as interdependent. And what that means is when you don't have, for example, the right to shelter, it's really hard for you to go to school and do your homework and other things. So they rely on each other and they build on each other to make a decent life. The kind of rights that I think a lot of you are involved in the development and the humanitarian space are rights like the work you do to promote and protect the right to healthcare, the right to education, to shelter, to food, to water, to an adequate standard of living. And in your work, you support the right to freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, the right to vote when you're supporting elections, and the right to development. And you also address discrimination in the work you do. Discrimination against women, against children, against people with disability, LGBTQI+ communities, and other marginalised people who are at the periphery of society and need our support. So I think 25 years ago when I got involved in this work, and particularly in my time in peacekeeping, it was really hard to be the human rights person in a peace and security humanitarian context. Often I'd get the eye roll, oh God, here she goes again. Or this is too urgent, this is a crisis, there's no time for your ponderings on human rights. It was really tough being a human rights officer in those intense conflict situations. My hope and my sense is that that's changed a lot now, and the UN system has come together in lots of ways to build a human rights-based approach into everything that it does. And when I talk about a human rights-based approach, they're pretty simple things, really. It's not brain surgery. We're talking about ensuring in the work we do participation, inclusive participation, non-discrimination between groups, equality of access, accountability to the people we're there to serve, transparency in how we work, and always trying to empower the communities we're working with in a sustainable way. So that's the human rights work, I think, that I've been working on for most of my career. And the second part of the question I wanted to respond to was, in the world we're facing today, with all of the shifting things, where is the best place to keep pursuing human rights objectives, promotion and protection of human rights? In my view, the UN system is really the only form of international cooperation where we can be assured that the promotion and protection of human rights will be at the top of the agenda. And that's partly because of the universality principle I spoke about before. If all the countries of the world have said that every person deserves the same set of rights, the UN is the best fora for ensuring we hold countries to account for that. But also because of those foundational documents that I spoke about earlier, the Charter, the Universal Declaration, the treaties, and the committees and special rapporteurs. There's a structure there for the protection of human rights that you don't find in any other multilateral or regional fora that I can think of. I'm thinking of the BRICS, the G20, the ASEAN Forum. They're really important fora, and maybe we can pursue a lot of things there that we can't push in the multilateral space anymore, but I don't think human rights is really one of those. The problem if we move away from a multilateral UN approach to human rights is that we'll start to see variance and discrimination and difference in how rights are upheld and protected in different countries for different people. And we know that when people's rights aren't respected, there's the possibility for conflict, for clashes, and for dismantling the security and the stability that we're all trying to achieve. So the UN provides the best ecosystem in my view, because the UN is an ecosystem with people working on everything from women's health through to protecting cultural heritage. You've got a framework there that's integrated to make sure that human rights are included in peace and security, in humanitarian work, development contexts, disarmament contexts, elections, security sector reform. So it creates an ecosystem where that you can take an intersectional approach to a person and to a community so that you can try and achieve dignity for them across all of the attributes that make them who they are. The last thing I wanted to say about the UN and the risks we face now with UN reform, many of you would be aware there's been a lot of criticism of UN 80 and the way it's structured and being pushed with maybe not enough time for reflection. Recently, Foreign Minister Penny Wong, when she was actually acting Prime Minister, opened the UNAA UN at 80 conference in Sydney, and she talked about the fact that if we're going to make more reforms to the UN, many of you know there've been lots of attempts to reform the UN. It has to be with a strategic purpose in mind, not just reform for the sake of cost cutting. And it occurred to me that we're looking at UN 80 and looking at the cuts. Office of the High Commissioner, for example, which already has a teeny tiny budget, I think it's 1% of regular and the other budget, is going to have a cut of 30%. This is going to have a huge impact on how human rights can be protected. Already we're seeing the treaty bodies having less money to go and do tours of countries. Countries are appearing less often and less regularly to present on the human rights situation in their countries. We really need to ensure as Penny Wong said, that it's a strategic reform that still holds on to the values of the Charter and still is pushing us in a direction of genuine multilateral cooperation. And so I wanted to just remind us all that not only did we just have UN 80 come down, but we also just a year ago had every single country in the world sign up to the UN Pact for the Future. I don't hear anybody talking about the UN Pact for the Future anymore, as though it no longer is relevant, it doesn't matter, it doesn't exist. Even if the resources are less, surely a form of that pact is what should be driving us forward in a strategic way. So I wanted to just finish off by sharing with you, a very dear friend of mine worked on that pact for a long time, and she said something recently that I thought was really profound and struck a chord with me, so I'll just share it with you. She said, count me amongst those who disagree that the UN is in decline. The institution may be struggling in the face of geopolitical differences, clogged bureaucratic arteries, and broken promises. But the idea of nations uniting to solve problems together is not dead. Most people around the world still fully believe in it and desperately need it. The Pact for the Future saw every single member state recommit to collective global problem solving, to the ideals of the UN Charter, and to updating the institution so it can serve its intended purpose. Don't change the subject. Don't forget what they signed last year, nor 80 years ago. Don't let them off the hook. I thought that was really powerful.
Really important. Thank you. Really important, really profound, as you said, to remind us. I'm going to throw a question to you, Esperanza, in relation to how does the health sector's challenges sit within the multilateral reform. But before that, I did want to reflect on this issue around the UN because, well, I throw my papers around. Who needs papers? There we go. Because there is no doubt at the moment, we're starting to understand that the problems we face, and often they're classified as the 3 Cs. You know, we're facing climate challenges, we're facing conflict, and we're facing COVID in the sense of global pandemics. They don't respect sovereign borders. We have a much better understanding that these challenges don't sit within a state-centric system. The UN was created to look at equal sovereign states. So we know that we need to work collaboratively within a state-centric system such as the UN, but as we're having all these pressures that are outside the state system put on us. And so I think whilst there's not the requirement to reimagine the whole system, I think it's incredibly important to build on the solid foundations of what, I think there's a lot of questions around the edges of how we can do it differently. And I look forward to all the answers being out here in the audience when I throw the microphone to them. But before then, Esperanza, would you like to talk about the health sector within the multilateral system?
And if you don't mind, Helen, I just really would like to make a little bit of a higher remark, and based on what you say, I think we are today having challenges with the basic fundamental right to life. I mean, if we look at many of the humanitarian crises today, many of the disregards for the norms that protect women, minorities, and so on, refugees, I mean, we are really, really tampering with the fundamental right. So, and that comes to the conversation, and probably you are already going to see these differences or not necessarily differences of opinion here, but how challenging this conversation of the UN reform and the multilateral system reform is. Because there is no doubt a system that was created after the Second World War, the fundamental basis, human rights, international humanitarian law, and more recently the protection for the environment, and so on and so forth, they are still foundational elements that we need to preserve. How do we do that? While reforming the house. Because the house no longer serves the purpose in a world that is more complex, that is more interconnected, and that is polarized. And it's not only that, this is a system that basically is, it has states on it, but doesn't necessarily reflect the reality of today. When it was created, for example, most countries in Africa were colonies. Today, they are no longer colonies. They do have sovereignty. They can decide their own future. They have their own vote. So there is a big push to say, can we actually have a UN structure, a multilateral system structure that delivers for today and for the future? And that requires a few things. The first one is the veto, for example, that a few countries have is a massive issue. The fact that only a few countries can decide for the rest of the world is no longer accepted, no longer valid. So the question is, how do we transform that if the very act of reform has to be sanctioned by those countries? So you have a little bit of a conundrum in there. And that will come, later we'll talk about civil society and the role of governments and communities and private sector. And that's a conversation that could take place in those environments. So when we look at the reform of the multilateral system, and that includes, of course, the humanitarian system, I personally think that we need to be very careful or work on 3 different layers. So the first layer is we need to acknowledge that we do need a UN or a multilateral system that upholds and ensures progress on agreed international commitments. We don't need to review our commitments. We already have them, and if anything, we need more countries signing up to them. But we need to, and we will argue, particularly in health and the protection of health, that we not only need to uphold the commitments, but we need to move forward on accountability. Because today, bombing a hospital, killing healthcare doctors, denying access for refugees to healthcare and essential services goes unpunished. We can no longer, that is no longer workable. And the millions of people that are affected because of that is something that we need to address. So it's how do we have a global structure that actually sets norms and advance progress and accountability. And that includes health, of course, for example, the World Health Organization and so on. At the same time, and as you say, we also need to acknowledge that there are plurilateral agreements and arrangements and regional bodies that can advance the conversations and can push for reform very, very much. We saw that in healthcare very clearly on the African bloc and the push for vaccine equity. And now the whole conversation about financing for the global health agenda and the UN reform is very much driven by a very solid African bloc. So you have regional entities that have a voice and say, actually, we want to bring potential solutions to the table. And in Asia and the Asia Pacific, that is also an opportunity moving forward. And the last point I would say, last but not least, is that we really need to deliver on localization. The first responders are the local communities. The ones that know where the pressures are and where the needs are the local communities, but we still don't have financing mechanisms that uphold that, and we still haven't transferred properly the power to respond to the local communities. So I think those 3 elements, maintaining the global and restructuring without damaging the foundations, and if anything, making them stronger, acknowledging the role of regional blocs and regional and plurilateral coalitions, and then really, really honoring the commitments that we have to communities. So.
Thank you. I think that's really a great way of stepping through some of our thinking in this space. I think the other issue too is for us not to be naive. There was never a golden age where all these rights were fulfilled, and often I always call it the narcotics of nostalgia. We believe there was a time where actually these things were all followed. I think it's always been aspirational in nature, and there's different pressures at different times, but we are not taking a system that was ideal, as you said, as you expressed. You know, even in its creation, it had its elements. I would like to ask you, Leanne, from your perspective of human rights, what role do you see both the civil society but also private sector playing as we move forward?
Thank you. I think if we look at the history of human rights progress, at least since the end of the Second World War, nothing would have happened without civil society. Civil society were behind every big change that was an advance for human rights, whether it was ending apartheid in South Africa, to bringing down dictatorships in South America, to the movement for First Peoples' rights around the world and in this country. Civil society start the flame and keep it alive and force the advocacy for change. So I think the UN system has acknowledged the role of civil society more and more over the last 80 years as well. For example, Australia will appear before the UN to deliver its Universal Periodic Review in January, and not only will the National Human Rights Institution have its own report that will differ from the government's report, but civil society will have a report too. So the UN has gradually learnt how to bring in civil society perspectives, even though it remains a member state-based multilateral organisation. In terms of business, global companies, I think we see them playing a much stronger role than they have in the past on human rights issues, usually framed in the ESG framing. And I have to say, from my perspective, there seems to have been more progress on the E and the G than the S, which is where human rights fits. Could you unpack that for everyone? Yes,
just in case people in the room
ESG, economic,
ESG.
Social and governance, I think. Am I right? Environmental.
Sorry, I shouldn't have asked you that.
No, sorry, I'm so used to the term. Pardon me. So not enough on the social, which is where the human rights fits. But you have things like the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, which is making great progress. You also have a lot of good work being done on modern slavery with businesses and supply chains. There will always be the competing incentives around profit motives for companies compared to their social obligations, but it seems like people in countries around the world are voting a lot more with their money in terms of who they're prepared to support, and when that affects the business's bottom line, that's where the impact can come from, I think.
Thank you very much. Esperanza, in the space of health, civil society, the role they play, private sector?
I will talk about civil society as a broader concept. It is, in the sense that if we look at some of the big gains that we have had in health, I mean, civil society has played a massive role. HIV/AIDS was a pandemic. Now it's a day-to-day issue that we manage in healthcare. And it was a massive civil society and patients' movement to say nothing about us without us. And that is a very clear example of the power of communities, the power of patients and advocacy groups. We also see vaccination, for example, the move towards the reduction of polio and measles. That is done by community health workers, by vaccinators, really reaching out even to remote communities in mules and walking and so on and so forth. So when we look at healthcare, it's one of those sectors where it's nothing you can advance without involving communities and civil society. And the other issue that we can see, for example, is reduction of maternal and child health as well, or the preparedness. And we see that very much in this region, the preparedness for natural disasters. Here we have the inception and the creators of the emergency medical teams, these local teams that actually are able to respond to the needs when they arise, and they have the resources to do so. So it's fundamental. I mean, civil society is at the heart of progresses that we have achieved and will continue to achieve. Now, the private sector, I don't think we any longer, and we have this conversation in Geneva for the last decade on how much do we involve with the private sector, yes or not. And you know, I am a very fierce advocate that the private sector should sit at the table when these conversations are having place, because they are part of the economic machine today. And when you look at how issues in certain big countries are done today, so front and forward the fact that businesses are involved in conversations of political nature. In relation to health, I think states do the negotiations within the UN systems, for example, for the pandemic agreement. Private sector is not sitting at the table, but is influencing through the conversations with different states. I am an advocate for transparency. I think the private sector should actually sit in those conversations and openly discuss what is it that, for example, the whole clause on sharing of pathogen sequencing and benefits of vaccines production and patents and so on. I think we should be having more open conversations. So yes, private sector involvement, but I think we need to move from lobbying to governments to actually having open conversations where civil society as well sits.
Yeah.
So
I think this interface between for-profit and not-for-profit in the sector, the interface between civil society and business, we need much more sophisticated conversations. It's not one or the other. They can't try and take each other over. Each has different strengths, each has different weaknesses, and we won't survive, I think, if we lose civil society. And we need business to keep going. So I think there's something in that space. So that's great to hear. Thank you. I'd like to take it to the audience now. There's lots of expertise here. I don't think have we got a microphone runner? Oh, we have a microphone. Thank you. Comments, questions? love to hear what your views. And also, please announce your name to start with. I think we've got someone to your right.
Thank you, Jenny Gordon, ANU. This is such an important area, really, and it's interesting to sort of hear about the UN Pact for the Future. And the question I have is about migration, because migration is now such a hot and divisive topic. And I guess because I've got this expertise down the front there, to get your thoughts on the Refugee Convention and where we should go on that. I mean, obviously, the UN Pact for the Future is trying to reduce the need for people to want to move, but we right now have a lot of people wanting to move and a lot of people, you know, really populism arising because of migration. So I'd just really like to get your thoughts on how do we go forward on this and find a solution where, you know, you can manage all the risks associated with it.
Fabulous. Leanne, did you want to start on that?
I don't have the answer. I haven't worked on international refugee law for a while, but I do look at the situation domestically in Australia, and it's really tough. The issues you point to around domestic politics seem to run the agenda in most of the world when it comes to how we apply international refugee law now. You are right, the long-term solution is going to conflict prevention, but that is a long-term solution. And in the meantime, in the midst of all these other crises, including now climate refugees and displaced people, it's really hard to see a way through as societies are closing and looking more inwards, and we're trying to be more global. It feels like you're pushing something up a hill with a stick. The only bright space I can see in the Australian context around refugee issues is the progressive work that's happening around community support for refugees. That's the only space where I can see some optimism around demonstrating different ways of doing things and bringing people closer together in terms of our shared humanity. Sorry, I can't offer more.
Anyone in the audience got expertise in refugee? I think this is really important to not just have the panellists. I'm very happy, if you'd like to say something on refugees, I'm happy to talk about UNHCR and others. But after Esperanza, if there's people in the audience that want to talk into that topic, I think it's a key one. It's where there's a lot of suffering, there's a lot of growing needs, and the political solutions don't seem to be fitting the reality. But Esperanza.
I am part of a Lancet commission that is looking at health, conflict, and forced displacement. And I think one of the challenges, not only with refugees, but broadly with the international bodies of law, is that they need to be translated into domestic law to be able to protect properly groups of population. And I think while there have been progress, particularly in the protection of refugees, the compliance with those mechanisms is really is not even across different contexts. And I think you have pointed, I think there are two issues here. One is the law, is how much of that is inserted into domestic law, and what are the compliance mechanisms within domestic law. But the other issue is this element of perception, communities' perception, and the polarization that is being so instrumentalized today in the political discourse on refugees, and you throw the whole refugees, including migration, everything. Anyone who moves basically falls within this category. And the problem with that is that basically you are demonizing the other. We are demonizing communities that are moving for different reasons. Many of them because they can no longer live in their own places due to war and due to prosecution of human rights violations, but others because of economic reasons. So I think that's an element where we will need this more open discussion, and potentially when we look at the way forward is how we foster conversations about the what joins us, which is at the end of the day our core humanity. And you put it up there, we are born equal, and it's a fundamental principle of how do we actually engage with each other and try to really counter these very negative polarized views that we are having today. And many of them are emerging from big powers, but they are also permeating across societies. And as I say, even in our local context, how do we actually have more humane and respectful conversations that foster an environment where then domestic implementation can move forward? So I think it's both elements that are required.
and I think a lot of the essence comes about this dehumanisation, which sits at the centre and is anathema to the frameworks we've got. Anyone else want to comment on, particularly on, anyone, go like this if it's on refugees, and, okay, here, sorry, Susan, we'll keep the conversation going on that topic, and then we'll jump to, I'm sure, what interesting things you have to say.
Thank you. So just on the topic of refugees...
Please introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, Imogen from ACFID, but I was formerly with the Danish Refugee Council, working in Turkey with the Syrian refugees, and I think there's a big discussion to be had around donors and how they frame their funding in this area as well, because we saw we were doing protection programming, so it was like legal protection for refugees and mixed migrants on the move. It was funded by the German government, and it had a very much a protection lens, but we saw as the political landscape changed across Europe that the language became more migration management. And this is not something the international organisations or UN agencies would like to work in on a principled position. And so there was a very awkward moment where even the civil society organisations, to maintain their funding, were trying to sort of access this funding, but the language had changed significantly. So I think there is a big role for donors in these conversations on how we reimagine the future to uphold this sort of principled approach in human rights. So thank you.
Thank you. I knew we had a rich and depth of knowledge in the audience, so thank you very much. So what we've heard, I think, on that is the need to think about the words, the local versus the global. And I know that, for example, UNHCR's work on the Global Compact, I mean, they've been very seized of this matter, trying to find new ways, new mechanisms to almost find the bridges between explaining and having a more public discourse about the benefits, not just having it more into the space of fear. Please.
Yes, and also raising refugees' voices and starting networks of refugees and having people tell their stories in a way that can reach people even better than talking about them. Yeah.
Exactly. Over to you, Susan.
It's connected. I'm Suzanne from Plan International, and I'm going to talk at the panel about anti-rights movements, and I think that it's all connected, I guess, is what I'm saying. And what you said just before about Esperanza, about the dehumanisation and the demonising of people, that's not an accident. You know, that's very well organised. It's incredibly well orchestrated. It's amplified by digital means. It's being funded. I happen to be in the UK, Ireland and Australia, where there were anti-immigration marches, and they were identical. They were like a template, and it was so interesting to see the use of symbols and frames and language. The symbol of the flag changed, but the flag symbol was used in all those contexts, and I could see it's like a really well orchestrated. I just think we should not forget to join the dots and the role we have to play, I guess, in our own community in upholding that original belief in the dignity and value of every human person and how we can articulate that in our own context. I just think, you know, there's the laws and the conventions, but there's the role we might be able to play, I guess, in just countering that massive organised movement.
Absolutely, thank you. And I think that's where we see between the normative framework, the implementation, and then the reality on the ground, whether it be civil society, whether it be business, whether it be politicians or media commentators. What we haven't sort of talked about today, and I want to go back to you as the audience if there's other points, is the role of new technologies, both for health, the good and the bad, and human rights, and how we can sort of analyse them. There was a brilliant session this morning that looked at new technologies, but I think we can't not include them as we look at some of these elements that we're trying to make the most of, understand, I would always say be soberly and very cautiously optimistic that you can shift them in the direction of usefulness for humanity. But I think we have to, you know, that's a classic example of utilisation of communication to keep forward a message. Back to the audience. Question here or comment would be lovely. Got the...
Thanks. I'm Helen Evans, and I have an honorary appointment at the Nossal Centre for Global Health at Melbourne Uni, but probably more relevant for this discussion, I also worked with the Global Fund for AIDS, TB and Malaria, and with Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. So I had a couple of comments and then some questions. I think the whole comment, I think, Esperanza, you made the comment about we need to reimagine while maintaining the services. And I think we've learnt from the USAID, if we needed to learn from that taking a sledgehammer to the system is absolutely devastating for so many people. So finding that balance is really difficult. I think, Esperanza, the way you summarised it with the 3 comments, 3 sort of areas that you'd reform, I think are really important. So the role of civil society doesn't really, it has, my experience anyway, it has a sort of token input into UN organisations, but it's not a very deep engagement. So with Gavi and the Global Fund, and they're both organisations that were started in the 200s, early 200s, and they need reforming too, because they're now 25 years old. But they do sit all the players around the table, and having experienced that, it makes a huge difference, and in terms of understanding others' perspectives and finding a middle ground. So a question for you, Esperanza, and I don't have the answer to it, so I'm going to ask you anyway. How, in any reforms of the UN system, you've talked about regionalisation, which I think is a big issue, how can we more integrate civil society or community's voice? We talk a lot about community engagement, how critical they are, etc., but they don't really have a strong voice in these forums. So that's a question for Esperanza. And Leanne, I had a question for you, and I'm sorry, it's a rather tough one, but I don't know whether you're at the session this morning with Eric Orlando.
Sadly, I missed it, but I should have been there by all accounts.
Oh, right. Well, he made a statement that said, rules-based order is backward-looking, doesn't meet the needs of the global south. We have multipolarity, we need to rethink it. I just wonder if you'd like to comment on his comment. Thanks.
So thank you, Helen, for your feedback. And I think you have really touched on the point of learning from each other. I think at this stage, there is no UN reform unless we learn from what others are doing. And there are active conversations, for example, in the health space between the World Health Organization and Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and the Global Fund for HIV/AIDS and malaria. So precisely because of that, how do we bring some of the best practices and the things that have worked into this broader reform? The challenge I see, and I have been this year going a participant or being witness to several of the conversations that are taking place within the health space, but broadly within the UN reform, is that there are still fragmented conversations. So there are groups of states or countries that are focusing on the financing of the humanitarian sector and the multilateral of the UN moving forward. There are other countries, and some of the efforts, for example, are led by the Wellcome Trust that has set up different regional consultations that will then feed back into a central level to try to see, okay, what kind of solutions emerge, with the idea that hopefully these consultations reflect local realities better than having a single global discussion. But I think states, and again, when we come back to the opportunities and moving forward, is there is really a big opportunity for groups of states to bring those local voices and local realities to the conversations. And that's where I think the regional blocks, because one single country can bring a voice, but if there is a group, it's a much powerful voice to bring to these conversations. At the end of the day, states are going to negotiate what comes next, because that's what we have, and is how civil society is involved in national consultations, how those translated into regional feedback, and then how they fit into the global final state. The risk and the challenge I see, and some colleagues of mine have already listened to me on this, is that we are facing very big challenges and changes in leadership coming up. So the World Health Organization will open in March next year, early next year, the call or the applications for the new Director General. So start the selection process for the new Director General of the World Health Organization. The UN Secretary General is going to change within a couple of years as well. And there are other UN bodies that basically are reforming based on budget cuts, not a strategy, and at the same time need to engage in a process that is highly strategic. So this UN reform is not going to wait 2 years to begin. It's underway. The conversations, the UN80 conversations, the UN humanitarian reform is moving forward, but it's moving forward at a time where existing leadership cannot take big decisions because they need to wait and see what happens with the incoming one. The incoming one is not yet known. So if we think that the environment today, and this is not to end up Friday afternoon with a terrible note, but if we think that today the environment is uncertain, I think it's going to get even worse. By having worked in crisis, and I really love crisis management, one of the things in crisis management is that there's great opportunity for influencing if you know how to do it and you know where to go. So this is a great space where civil society can have constituencies, can really talk to their politicians, talk to their governments, and then create meaningful impact, because it's so much up in the air that the opportunity to influencing is actually there and probably bigger than ever had been. So
I can't agree more on that point, and we know that, you know, during COVID, the opportunities of so many states that, say, for example, the ICRC had been knocking on the door to get access to prisons, so many states were able to open the door, felt during COVID that the ICRC could go in, and so it was fascinating from a diplomatic point of view to be able to suddenly having conversations with heads of states, the president, but also ministries who suddenly wanted something that we'd been knocking on the door for many, many years.
Because there was no clarity, because the environment was so fluid.
Exactly, and perhaps they thought that it was better for another organisation to go into these, having gone in a lot myself, very packed prisons, there was a fair bit of COVID. So then if you can keep that going forward, if you can take what was experienced during the crisis, hold on to it, sustain it, and I think you beautifully talked about the fact that sometimes we need to move forward, sometimes we need to hold on to what we've developed, is really important. Please.
I think it's a really important point. Unfortunately, what we learn is that we come together in crises, and once the crisis is over, it all falls apart again. How do we maintain that momentum? And, you know, we've done some terrific things in a range of crises, but it then falls apart and everybody goes back to their old roles.
We have such short memories, or the system comes back. Anyway, I want to give Leanne that fabulous question, because having sat with Eric last night at dinner, we had fairly good, robust discussions. I loved it. But also hearing him today really was important for us to hear. We've got to challenge ourselves. We can't look like we just, you know, the system moves on. But is it as dire, and is there a complete rupture of the liberal democratic order that was in place?
Tell me you're not adding that to the question for me to answer. Thank you for that question. And what I say now, I say without the context of having heard Eric today, and I may have misunderstood. So, but damn no, that makes it, I would say our challenge is not that the rules-based order is looking backwards or out of date, but we need to figure out how to expand the rules-based order to include more actors, including the private sector. I've been thinking about something related to what you raised, which is that 80 years of the UN and building a rules-based order, sometimes I don't think we give ourselves enough credit for how much has been achieved over 80 years in terms of establishing some framework that all nation states can buy into. And it goes from the really mundane things like how we organise international aviation or mail systems through to more of the juicy stuff that we're all interested in. But we've made a lot of progress, and in the space that I work in the human rights space, we've moved such a long way, I think, from human rights being perceived as a Western construct. Years and years of work and partnership across a lot of different countries has meant, I think, that in terms of how we face the challenges that we're facing today, there are a lot of people in a lot of countries who are really invested in the rules-based order that we've established, and who have bought into the ideas and the ways of working in a way that if we were to turn away from it now, holus bolus, it'd be a great shame, and it would undermine their confidence in international cooperation. And I say that because I think it's time for us, and we'll come to what we can do next, but I think it's time for us to come together as countries and communities with shared values, forget global north and south, across cultures, across continents, across hemispheres. And that's probably going to be a lot of middle powers, hopefully including Australia, but smaller countries as well. That's the way we can organise to hold on to the things we've got. And I just wanted to share one quick example of where I've seen this in my human rights work. This week I got to meet with the Indonesian Deputy Minister for Human Rights. In 1995, I was volunteering for an illegal human rights NGO under the Suharto regime. The idea that this week I could be speaking to the Deputy Minister for Human Rights is freaking astonishing. And as an Australian, I'm sorry, where's our Ministry for Human Rights? I'm sitting there learning from Indonesians on how to do domestic human rights implementation. And I think in this country we've got to get rid of this idea that we know best and we know how it's done, and start opening our ears and our minds to learning from others and pulling together with them for these fundamental principles.
Thank you. I think that's really important. And we do have to look at the freaking, as you would say, very politely, advances we've made. And there is sometimes a predisposition that cynicism is intelligent, and genuinely searching for solutions and using what we've got is somehow naive. And I always think it's actually the opposite. It's naive to think that we cannot survive going forward without searching for solutions, building on what we've learnt, and then ignoring and trying to reshape what we haven't. And I think this sense of superiority is absolutely critical if we believe in what you put up. Before I throw it back to the floor, another example just to share with you. Leanne is a lawyer in the humanitarian area. I remember as a young lawyer back in the 90s on a panel talking about the importance of creating a treaty to regulate or ban the use of anti-personnel landmines, the Ottawa Treaty eventually. I remember I was on a panel with two doctors. Love doctors, always love working with doctors. And at the end, sorry? Doctors and lawyers. What more does a girl need? At the end, a lot of questions were like, okay, you lawyers, you just talk. What's this treaty going to do? A landmine won't know if there's a treaty. We need more doctors. Stop the lawyers, need more doctors. Now, 20 years later or further on, we know that we've reduced the suffering by anti-personnel landmines by a massive percent. It used to be up to 20,000 people a year killed or maimed, and now it's down to about 6,000. It's growing again. It's one of these areas we have to hold on to. But if you think over 20, 25 years, those thousands and thousands of lives that has been saved, because it wasn't just a treaty, it's just a piece of paper, it's just a framework. You know, companies were stigmatised if they invested in the creation of these weapons. States had to destroy them if they signed up to the treaty. And it was one of those things that's like, we forget that. They sort of say, oh, this is pathetic. International law, it's pathetic. But in fact, if you take a step back and you look at where you were when you were in Indonesia compared to you are today, now that doesn't mean in any form or other, and doesn't negate the terrible, terrible suffering we see daily around the world. It's not one or the other. You can be still experiencing and having the imperfect state of humanity, and it's all glory and it's all suffering. But if we forget that actually we are moving forward, we lose the energy to keep moving forward. So I think I love that idea. I wish we could do a little movie of you then and you now and say, look at the frickin' change. I think that would be great. But I want to throw it to the audience. I see Dr. Rick.
Thanks, Dr. Helen. 2 points. Firstly, I fully agree on, we're not giving ourselves enough credit for the progress we've made on a number of fronts. And I feel that in the humanitarian sector, because I think some of the biggest criticisms are coming internally. And I sometimes feel that we're, cannibalizing ourselves and undermining ourselves. So, one of my closest friends keeps saying, oh, the system's broken. And wrote recently, it's entirely broken. And I'm like, look where we've come. And it sends a terrible message to our frontline workers to say, you're not delivering. Well, they are delivering if you give them the access and the resources. But there are so many constraints that, I think we need to give ourselves a bit more of a pat on the back from time to time. Secondly, Leanne, it was great that you put up Article 1 of the Universal Declaration. I mean, I think the US Declaration of Independence is even more powerful in some ways. It says, we hold that these truths are self-evident, that all men are, entitled to, inalienable rights. So it's a truth and it's self-evident. But then getting back to that talk that you weren't able to attend, Eric did say that China doesn't buy into universal values. And that was striking to me because I've been in situations where our international humanitarian law and our humanitarian principles and by extension human rights have been challenged. I remember meeting a Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs in one of the toughest conflicts, and he said to a group of us, we don't buy your international humanitarian law, we don't buy your humanitarian principles, and that's because we know where your money comes from. So, and now we've got the US Secretary of Defense or Secretary of War saying we need rules of war that allow us to be more lethal. I forget his exact term. So if Eric's characterization is true, and we've all run into situations in many instances where people push back on these universal principles, where do we go? I mean, what are your thoughts on how we can bolster these principles and these norms when they're openly under attack or rejected?
I mean, I'd love to know what Eric sees as the alternative from anyone who was there too. I don't see another alternative, but given we're talking about international law and international diplomacy, then it's going to require a coalition of member states who are prepared to stand up for these fundamental principles, to use every weapon in their armoury to have influence on any particular state. If it's China, in the past has it been Russia? We have to use trade, we have to use aid, we have to use diplomacy, we have to use all of our tools to encourage them to change their minds or to come back to those. I don't see another way.
Esperanza, and then I'll
Yes, I would like to really come back. I think we need to do more work on this idea that the humanitarian principles are a Western construct. And I think, and that's really each one of us role here. So it's not just government, civil society, but us, each one of us. And when we talk about humanitarian principles, even though we are not at war or in a crisis situation, I mean, humanity is just the basic principle that we all humans are equal. There is no human which is more or less than another. Of course, that's when you talk about anti-terrorism laws and so on and so forth. That's been challenged, but that's the main principle. And the other principle that I believe it really unites us in action is impartiality. And impartiality is defined as providing services to those who need it the most. And for that, you can ask a Chinese official, if your house is on fire, who will you say first? Oh, I will go for my grandmother because she cannot move. Or you have very scarce food, and then you have pregnant women probably, and babies. Those are the ones that are going to get the food first, if we are left as to communities to choose. And we saw the massive outpour and have seen now of solidarity and voluntarism in the current floods in the Asia Pacific, taking place in Asia. So that is inherently human. We inherently are impartial. We respond to those who are most in distress, and we acknowledge our shared humanity. So I do believe that this conversation about what unites us is a powerful one if we really tap into that, but we really need to work to do that, because the algorithms and all the different communication and misinformation tools today are pulling us into the, oh no, we are different, we are better, third world countries, developed countries, whatever. We really need to work on a counter narrative that we feed, and we feed our children and our generation and coming generations as well.
I think it's so ironic today that we're more interconnected and we're more siloed than ever before. But I think just to answer a little bit of that, and I flagged it a little bit last night when I spoke, we have to be careful not to bring cultural relativity too heavily into this whole area. Having said that, and I've always found it fascinating when I work with non-state armed groups who intrinsically reject the idea of laws or treaties because they're state they're created by the state. But when you actually break down what it means and say, do you believe during times of armed conflict, for example, certain civilians should be protected, or you should treat the remains of the dead in a certain way, you find such resonance with that. So sometimes it's how we translate it on the ground. And I never forget working with a fantastic Islamic scholar who I brought into the team, and he worked with Islamic leaders in the Sahel region, and they did a fatwa on the protection of humanitarian workers because it correlated so well with Islamic teachings. And we saw the attacks on healthcare workers and humanitarian workers in that area reduce. Not going in saying, you know, Article 72 of the Third Geneva Convention says this, but saying within your own systems, beliefs and understandings, if these people are working impartially, then they should be looked after. So I do think that, you know, we have to be careful about having this total articulation that there is a universal values, because it allows people to come in and say there's so many cultural differences. But I do think at the end of the day, profoundly, being human is something that is shared a lot. And I'm sure everyone in this room has done some sort of work outside their own culture, seeing these commonalities. And we just need to build on those and move out. So I think the idea of everyone being born free and equal with dignity and rights is pretty hard to argue against on a personal level. But I think you're right, we're being pushed at times to say the system doesn't work. Here, two more questions, and then we'll throw to the panellists to finish off. I might take two in a row, and then thanks.
Thank you. I think it's been a great panel so far. I'm Annabelle Delhunty from the Crawford School here at ANU. I think I'll just very quickly add two things, I think. One is, I think, you know, human rights are so important. I fundamentally believe in them. But how do we then promote them given the hypocrisy of many countries, you know, for example, supporting Israel? And it's a very valid claim, like human rights for you but not for you and whatnot. So how do we get over that hypocrisy? And then this is just more of a comment than a question, but I do think that the international liberal order needs to be passed out. I think there's components of it which are good, like international human rights, but there's also the global economic system, which has really held the global south back, and the structural adjustment programs of the 80s and 90s, and that's all part of it. You know, the World Trade Organization rules and everything else. So I think there's elements of it that work, you know, international human rights, but there's also elements that have been deeply problematic and have kept, for example, Africa in poverty. So, you know, I don't think we should bundle it all together. Thank you.
So I want to share a lived experience, I suppose, relevant to the theme of being recruited by this guy into the UN out of the Australian context, and then actively resigning in late 2019 because I didn't feel it was going the right way. And two reasons to share. One, living through the World Humanitarian Summit build-up, where we had amazing meetings in the regional level talking about we want a system of local response. That's what I understood from the conversation. And then in the pre-meeting we had in Geneva, where I was in several of the panels, I saw the lens or the framing change, and it was, how does the UN become more localized? And that was not the conversation, but that was what was taken to Istanbul. My second big sort of my epiphany really causing me to leave was pressure from Trump 1.0 to become more visible as a UN agency, to be seen to come in over the top of, and I had been, Esperanza mentioned it earlier, involved in building national capacity, about 130 countries, medical response teams, all about local, and then that country helping their neighbor with these standards. And it has this organic growth, it's huge now. But I felt I couldn't work any further in the UN system that was building itself to come in over the top, to just make sure it survived. And instead we're trying to do it a different way through Respond Global with the response we do in Vanuatu, where we quietly support locals to respond for themselves. And I suppose my segue to, I presume your close, Helen, will be, how does the UN... First of all, I love the idea of Esperanza's top level, normal setting, etc. There is a role, of course there is, and we have to define that clearly for the UN, but not have them mission creep, drift, or think that they're going to become this amazing police officer or responder for the world. That is not future-proofed, and it can't be scaled. And how do we stop trying to get the dollars through us and then trickle? We know trickle-down economics in the US didn't work, and it doesn't work in this system either. Thanks.
Thank you very much. What I might do is, unless you wanted to specifically answer, would you like to finish off with where you think the solutions are and take into account these two very important statements?
I just would like to pick up on what you say, because I think that's one of the challenges that we see today, is that the conversations about the structure in the multilateral system and the UN particularly are at the moment detached from the governance and from the funding conversations, and they are all linked. So, and when I say the funding, I'm not saying the funding of the system, but the funding of economies and health sector and so on. So it's this big economic conversation on how the world today trades, manages the economies and so on, and the governance of that system. Those conversations they need to be had, but they are not coming together. When and how they will come together, that's the big question, because of what I say. The changes of leadership are going to obstruct somehow the coming together of those conversations. But it's something to really look at how they could be coalesce somehow. They cannot be separate. And some of the conversations, for example, in the health sector, very much have to do with economics, the economics of health, governance of health, financing of the different aspects of healthcare. And one of the things, for example, just to say how these conversations really need to come together, because there is a high risk of really losing through the cracks some of the services for fragile communities, is happening on the financing of the health sector. So many are today, and including some governments, are saying this is a fantastic opportunity. The fact that the US is no longer a player has forced ministries of health to own their own health systems. They should be paying for their own health systems. The health of populations is the responsibility of national government, so be it, that's it. But within that, the challenge is that we are forgetting that there are some very fragile contexts where external support is required. Otherwise, millions of people are going to die. So this risk of throwing the baby out with the bathwater is really real, because the two conversations need to converge. What is it? And strategically, the question in this humanitarian or multilateral reform and humanitarian system reform is, what is it that we need to preserve? And we are not having those conversations yet. And then what is it that we need to preserve from the health? What is it that we need to preserve from the human rights? Maybe all of it. What is it that we need to preserve in conflict settings? What is it that we need to preserve on trade? What are the key building blocks that we cannot lose? Once you have that, then you can say, what is the structure that will serve that, the governance that will serve that, the financing mechanisms that will serve that. That is not yet happening, and that, I think, is one of the big risks.
Did you want to, maybe I'll go to Leanne for closing ideas around how we move forward, so we don't just sit in the problem analysis. Solutions, so to speak, that's a big word, but ways we can move forward, and then we'll come to you. Leanne.
Just quickly on Annabelle's point, the question of human rights and hypocrisy. I think two quick answers to that. The Universal Periodic Review process was redesigned with the new human rights framework, because every country needs to answer for itself. So no country is excluded from that detailed analysis, which is really equalising and important. And secondly, I think one of the things Australia's used to do a lot of, now only does a little bit of, is bilateral human rights dialogues. We have them with Vietnam and Laos at the moment. I'd like to advocate for more in a moment. But one of the really important reasons that we participate in that dialogue as a national human rights institution, as opposed to government, is because when we're sitting there opposite Vietnam, I want to independently say to the Vietnamese, did you know that in some Australian states, children as young as 10 can be put in prison? So we have to be honest about our own failings and say no country is perfect on human rights. Here's our problems. Here's what we're doing well. How about you? I think that's the only way to be honest about it. And I wanted to thank you for sharing your lived experience. I'd love to have a beer with you sometime to talk about the many times I nearly walked away from the UN. I think it's really important that you centred us back on the idea that the UN shouldn't exist for its own sake, and that we join the UN to serve, and that one of the founding principles we haven't talked about today of the UN was self-determination of individuals, of communities, and of countries, so it's really important. I wanted to finish off on a where to now by focusing on where I think Australia can play a role. I think Australia at this point in time, and for the next few years maybe, is really well placed to pick up the gauntlet and play a leadership role in what we've been talking about in terms of middle, small powers, galvanising together for international cooperation. Australia has got the history of really close involvement in the establishment and support for the UN. We've benefited as a middle power from engaging through multilateral processes. It's supported our national interest to engage in multilateralism. We've got strong government engagement now that we can leverage. So Australia's on the Peace Building Council. We're bidding for a Security Council seat. We're going to play a lead role in COP31. And now, last week, the government announced in the human rights space that we have an inaugural envoy for international human rights in the space I work in. Mark Dreyfus is taking up that role. So that's the context of why we're well positioned. The things I'd like to see Australia do or keep doing are continuing a multilateral approach to engagement on human rights. So I mentioned the human rights dialogues. Indonesia is interested in having a bilateral human rights dialogue with us. Surely that would be in our interests. We used to have a bilateral dialogue with China. Let's think about how we can put our international human rights engagement on the front foot in that honest sharing way. Australia is a massive supporter of national human rights institutions around the world, always takes the pen on new resolutions in the Council and the General Assembly for national human rights institutions. If Australia can continue to play that strong role and to push for that, that will be really important. That multi-layered approach, including engagement through ASEAN, through the Pacific Island Forum, it adds value to sending the same message at different levels and with different partners. And increasing our investment in the UN. We're grateful at the moment that the UN hasn't decreased its funding to the UN, but with other countries pulling away, how can we do more? Including how can we support more UN engagement in our own region, which is pretty thin compared to other parts of the world. Australia's got a great reputation around protection of civilians and women, peace and security. It would be great to continue that work and potentially to expand it to defending human rights defenders who, as we all know, are really under attack all around the world. And just to finish, very importantly, I think we need to walk the talk. So Australia's UPR in January is going to be really important for this government to show its commitment to human rights implementation in Australia if we're going to take on that bigger role in the world.
Thank you. I would like to build on what you say, and I think there is a great opportunity for Australia not only in human rights, but also in health, for example. Australia is very much present on negotiations on the pandemic agreement. Maybe many of you know that Australia has a global health ambassador, has had for the last few years, and was recently a new one was announced. So it's a diplomatic commitment to actually be present on health-related conversations. But I think it's an opportunity as well to influence conversations in relation to the UN reform. I think you opened this panel saying there are voices that say the system is completely broken, we need something completely different to it's business as usual. No, I think we cannot continue with the structure we have today. A new one needs to emerge, keeping track of the fundamentals, not to lose them along the way. Those conversations really, Australia and other middle powers have the capacity, and not necessarily other middle powers, create coalitions in the region and with others to actually put forward proposals. There is a level of uncertainty, hoping that somebody else will know the solutions is not going to work. No one today has the solutions. It will have to come through a collective process. So that's at the national level. And Australia is already doing a lot in relation to advocating for human rights and principled action, but I think can do more. The second thing is at sector level. I think I started the conversation saying how health is not only a health sector issue, so I think we need to find out a way of doing more cross-sectoral collaboration, and cross-sectoral collaboration is really hard because there are silo budgets, because there are silo structures and so on. So I do see a sector that has a very good role moving forward is the academic sector. Not only to respond to research questions or problems that the governments or the societies have, but to be more propositional, to say actually in this environment, positive ways or evidence that we have can be used to actually foster more cross-collaboration within the government, but also across governments and across different industries as well. How do we bring the private sector and civil society into the conversation? And my last point is us as individuals. And I think at the moment, and again, it's a time of crisis, a multiple crisis, polycrisis, I think is what can we do within our own realm to foster positive change, and change that is principled, that is based on what joins us as humanity and this principle of impartiality, helping the one or a system that delivers for those who are at greater risk. I think if we have the right conversations, if we have, that includes within our households, our communities, our organizations, and then transmit that to politicians and then just really, really generate change, it can really coalesce into more powerful forces. So I think those, at every level, there is possibilities to influence change.
Thank you. I'm going to close now. We're just on time. Thank you. I wanted to thank you as an audience. Of course, it's always a bit different when you suddenly lose a panellist, but I hope that we've been able to frame all the issues that we could. But I wanted to thank you for the experiences that you shared, for the questions, and for the engagement. I think we need these conversations. You can't summarise this. It would be arrogant for us to think in an hour and a half we can come to the answers of the massive questions of the multilateral system. I do think there's just a couple of few things. We have a range of tools. They've always been under pressure. They're under particular pressure at the moment, but they are there and we're able to use them. We know now and have structures and systems, as you mentioned really clearly in my mind, of having a human rights, deputy human rights in countries. We've got some tools. We're not at a loss. We need to be cognizant of where we've moved forward, as I said. Maybe pat ourselves on the back, or maybe just, I think we are the worst often in our sector. The more passionate we are, the more we make noises that it's not working, and the more the vicious circle then the community and the public go, oh, it doesn't work. So how do we change the discourse? But how do we build on what needs to be improved and get rid of elements that don't work, and also make sure that we don't have self-satisfying or self-realisation, the UN point, how do you make sure the system is not just in its evolution trying to control power rather than open it up? I think there are some of the key elements. And at the end of the day, how do we really hold on very closely in a personal, professional, regional, international sense of Article 1, where we have to believe that all humans are born free and equal with dignity and rights. See you, and thank you very much for participating. Thank you for the audience, the two panellists.